Hello everyone, and thank you for checking out my YouTube channel, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. My name is Nick Barksdale and I am your host today, and I am very excited to bring you a very special guest, Dr. Lincoln. Dr. Lincoln is going to be doing a very interesting and fascinating talk about a very obscure subject in medieval history. A subject that revolves around a golden rose. In 1148, Pope Eugene III sent a most unusual, but not unprecedented, gift to the Emperor of León, Alfonso VII. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you all today, and to bring you a wonderful and excellent teacher, Dr. Lincoln. Ladies and gentlemen, sit back and relax. Feel free to take notes and comment your thoughts below, and more importantly, have a great time. Thank you all so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for checking us out on YouTube today. This is the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages, and I am your host, Nick Barksdale. And today I'm joined by a very special guest who I was just talking about earlier, and that is Dr. Lincoln. Dr. Lincoln, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So right now, as we're recording this in January of 2020, I teach in the history department at the University of Wisconsin's La Crosse campus. I did my PhD in medieval history and finished that in 2016 at St. Louis University. Since then, I've taught at Kalamazoo College, a little bit at Western Michigan University as well in between. I'm at present finishing up a book on the Castilian Church under Alfonso VIII, who hopefully we'll speak about more in the coming weeks. And I'm at present on the boards for the American Academy of Research Historians of Medieval Spain, which is a mouthful. Here comes another acronym that takes forever, as well as the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies, Episcopus, which is the Society for the Study of the Clergy in the Medieval World, and last but not least, the Society for the Study of the Crusades in the Latin East. All of that is to say that most of my experience in academia has been in crusading in 12th century Iberia, in ecclesiastical stuff. So hopefully what we're talking about today will be a nice little entryway into some of those questions and conversations, kind of tip of the iceberg for a much bigger conversation that scholars are having, and hopefully give some people some suggestions on some things to look at in their own reading and edification.
That is absolutely phenomenal. Honestly, I can't wait to get into this.
A lot of people are relatively familiar with the idea of giving flowers as a token of affection. And we often think about the act of gift giving as a kind of way to understand social relationships, right? We give gifts in times of great significance, whether that be religious significance, at the time of the holidays has just passed us by, or in times of great social significance, right? We give people gifts at the occasion of their wedding or a birthday, times where we invest things with a lot of meaning. A lot of times we have those gifts, or we have cards, we have personal mementos. But as you can imagine, over time, our families might lose track of the original gift, or they might lose track of the card. Imagine then 8.5 centuries removed, the kinds of echoes that we might have of significant exchanges of gifts. That's kind of what I want to set as our backdrop for what we're talking about today. Because in 1148, Pope Eugenius III, often sometimes called Eugene III, entirely unimportant how we pronounce it, both names work just as well, a Cistercian pope who had actually been elected in part because of his relationship to the then most important religious intellectual of the period, Bernard of Clairvaux, of course the abbot of Clairvaux and sort of leader of the Cistercian order. Eugenius III sent a single flower, apparently golden, whether it was a sculpted gold rose or the idea being that it was somehow a gilded actual rose is entirely unknown. I suspect that it's probably a sculpture, as that would be a little bit more durable, to the then reigning king of León and Castile, a man by the name of Alfonso, so styled Alfonso Raimundes in some chronicles because he was the son of a Burgundian count who had journeyed to Spain to make his fortune and had married then a princess about to be queen, Urraca of León and Castile. Exactly why he gave this gift is unknown. There are some stated reasons. Alfonso's position as this kind of athleta Christi in the contemporary vernacular, an athlete of Christ, this person struggling for some greater achievement. But as is usually the case, medieval documents will only tell us what they want us to know first and foremost, and will often have a large background of evidence, of conversation, of relationship that's only partially hinted at or echoed in documents. Giving a golden rose seems like a pretty strange gift, especially if we remember that the Pope, as this sort of pinnacle and wielder of the so-called spiritual sword in the Galatian version of things, the two swords being spiritual and material, that is to say, religious authority and temporal power. Giving a rose doesn't really seem like a normal gift for a king. We can think of a lot of the trappings of royal investiture, whether it be a sword belt or a sword, a cloak, a crown, a ring, all of these things that might suggest affection. But we know that the popes gave lots of gifts over the Middle Ages. One of the most important and symbolic was actually a gift frequently given by popes to archbishops, a woolen garment called the pallium, which was studied brilliantly and recently, award-winningly, by Stephen Schoening in his book Bonds of Wool. A simple garment, a simple cloth collar, effectively, a pallium drapes around the neck and goes down on either side and it's sort of meeting in the middle. A piece of wool, right? That gift doesn't seem that significant, but as Schoening has shown, say that 3 times fast, as Schoening has shown, laying that piece of wool on the tomb of St. Peter not only made the garment a contact relic, but was a symbol of the spiritual connection between the popes themselves as givers of the gifts and the recipients, the archbishops in question. So thinking about gift giving as this kind of statement of a relationship, we can look at this individual golden rose as an important window into what Pope Eugene III thought of, at least for a time, Alfonso VII. But I should back up and do a little bit of background, because by now we've named a bunch of people who we haven't even introduced. So let's start with the king in question. Alfonso VII of León and Castile is sometimes referred to as Alfonso the Emperor. He's not the first to be called an emperor. In fact, that title, Emperor of all the Spains, might go back as early into the 10th century, although the best evidence suggests that it's early in the 11th, in the time of Fernando I. As Hélène Sir-Antoine has shown in her wonderful book, Imperator Totius Hispaniae, there is at least some kind of sense of this Emperor of the Spains as a kind of leader of the Christian kingdoms in the north. Not entirely dissimilar to other similar appellations amongst regional kingship, but what makes it particularly interesting is that although this title Imperator would normally suggest a kind of regional conglomeration of power under which a single figure, not entirely dissimilar to the Holy Roman Empire, that doesn't seem to quite be the case in the Iberian monarchies. Instead, what it seems to be is a kind of recognition of prestige, a kind of appellate jurisdiction in some sense, that connects all of the kingdoms and territories together. Alfonso doesn't come by this title easily. In fact, he comes by it having fought off a number of rebellions and having his own succession something in doubt, in part because his grandfather and namesake, Alfonso VI, although allegedly the sort of conqueror of Toledo, although there wasn't ever actually any conquest, he just sort of walked in. I always imagine him walking through the northern gate, past where there's now a churro stand, through the Bisagra gate, almost unaccompanied except by his own royal retinue, into this city. The recapture of Toledo in 1085 was a kind of signal moment for the Christian kingdoms in the north, especially for León, which had been struggling for legitimacy against other regional partnerships. We know that, for example, in the late 10th and early 11th century, by far the most powerful of the Christian kingdoms was the Basque kingdom of Navarre under Sancho III, also sometimes called Sancho the Great. Usually when you're in charge of most things, you get to be the Great or the Emperor. In that moment, Alfonso VI, in taking over Toledo, had recaptured what had previously been under the Visigothic kingdom, which of course was eclipsed under the Muslim conquest in the early 8th century, had previously been the kind of urbs regis, right? That royal city, that kind of, we want to say capital in the modern version, but it's not at all that in any real sense. Rarely are there solid capitals in the medieval world. We know that. But instead, there are cities that are kind of centers of gravity, right? Toledo is one of them. certainly, especially for the Kingdom of Toledo, as it's often labeled as one of the many places that Leonese and Castilian monarchs will claim. They'll also claim Burgos as the kind of importance and the trade routes in the east to west route from the Pyrenees towards Santiago de Compostela, both as a pilgrimage route and for trade, of course. We can also mark out León or Oviedo in the Kingdom of León itself. We could also point to Santiago de Compostela as an important sort of position point. Iberian kings were itinerant, and so Alfonso's recapture of Toledo added another stop on that route. The bigger the connection he could make, the more important his kingship would seem. But it's important also to remember that Alfonso was not alone in attempting to assert himself. We know that there are similar attempts in the eastern part of the peninsula, particularly under the Catalan counts. They're all named Ramon Berenguer. Even when there are twins, there's a Ramon Berenguer and a Berenguer Ramon. Of course, they get into some trouble during a hunting accident. And things become a little bit more difficult. But for Alfonso VI, this is a time where there's a lot of struggling, right? A struggle that allegedly leads him to conspire to kill his brother, Sancho II, the famous episode that creates the treason that Rodrigo Diaz de Bivar apparently says is the last straw. Although there's quite a good bit of work that suggests that none of that actually happened, although there was a civil war of some sort between Alfonso and his brother Sancho. There does seem to have been a difficulty for Alfonso VI in coming into kingship. One of the signal moments in his early reign, however, is his cementing of his alliance with the papacy just 5 years before taking Toledo. At a council in 1080, Alfonso changed over, at least nominally, the religious ordo, so the pattern in which the Mass was said, from an older Visigothic, it's often sometimes referred to inaccurately as a Mozarabic rite, to the later adopted and more contemporary in Roman and Frankish circles, Roman rite. And so by shaping the way the Mass was said, this is a powerful symbol. When you remember that the rhythms of life in the medieval world are often governed by religious observance, that liturgical change is a huge signal to the papacy in Rome, but also to the religious officials of the kingdom that, in fact, Alfonso is playing by the rules and he's playing on a papal team. No doubt then that in 1085, with the re-annexation of Toledo, is then Alfonso able to acclaim a new archbishop, and the sort of early struggles of the archbishops of Toledo, not only to have control of over their own city and to repopulate it with Christians, both of the Mozarabic persuasion, that is to say Arabic-speaking Christians, but also of Christians from beyond the Pyrenees. We know that there's a huge influx of what are usually referred to as Franchi, so probably in modern terms, French, Swiss, Northern Italian, perhaps even parts of Belgium and Holland, parts of Germany as well in our modern geography. So lots of people coming into the peninsula. Alfonso is in particular difficulties with shoring up the large tectonic arrangement of powers in his own court. And so he marries one of his daughters, Urraca, to one of two brothers who come to the peninsula from Burgundy. The elder is called Raymond, the younger is Henri. Raymond marries Urraca, Alfonso's legitimate daughter, and Henri marries his illegitimate daughter, Teresa. Those two women, Urraca and Teresa, often get sort of papered over in the telling of histories of medieval Iberia, but they play a really important role for two reasons. First, Teresa's son, Alfonso Henriques, is the first king of Portugal. And Urraca's son, Alfonso VII, is this Emperor of the Spains, as he's often acclaimed in later chronicles. Yet these two women occupy really important roles because after Alfonso VI's death, they're actually the ones that are guaranteeing their son's power. As Gianna Bianchini in her work on Berenguela of Castile has shown for a later century, and as Lucy Pick's recent book, Her Father's Daughter, has made very clear, while we're often used to thinking of medieval women as sort of backroom figures, as palace politicians, as patronesses of the arts, Iberian queens seem to have taken a much more direct role, both in the administration of their property. We have lots of later evidence to suggest that they were directly administrating their lands, but also raising and shepherding armies. They don't seem to have led in battle the way Matilda of Canossa does, but she's a contemporary of theirs, and it's not an inaccurate comparison to see Matilda of Canossa playing a similar role as both protectress of the church, but also as high political figure. Problematically, Urraca's husband, Raymond, dies before her son comes to his majority. And so Urraca is left as the reigning queen. Her father's illegitimate son, Sancho, dies at a pretty disastrous battle before Alfonso himself does. And so we're left with this mother of two small children, Sancha and Alfonso VII, later to be Alfonso the Emperor, right? He's not the seventh yet, he's just the prince. And she's stuck in a lot of ways. She's got vassals that are really worried. We've got this unmarried woman on the throne, which presents lots of political, intellectual, and cultural problems. Yet she seems to be very capable. The solution they seem to have proposed is a marriage with the then King of Aragon, Alfonso the Battler, who of course is famous for his conquests, especially of Zaragoza, but should probably have his reputation reevaluated based on the evidence from Urraca's reign. By some acclamations, Urraca and Alfonso's marriage is annulled on grounds of their closeness of descent, their consanguinity. They're related a few generations back to previous kings. But the more pressing matter seems to have been that Urraca and Alfonso absolutely did not get along, and some contemporary evidence seems to suggest that even by medieval standards, and I want to underline that, even by medieval standards, Alfonso I was something of an abusive husband, physically at least. By contemporary terms, that's really saying something.
Yeah.
There are lots of examples of what is acceptable levels of beating your wife in the medieval world, right? Of course, by modern standards, that's a super low threshold. You can kill a spider, but anything more than that, you're probably going to get in trouble for. In the medieval world, we can imagine what that must mean. We do know that Alfonso and Urraca never had children, which makes a little bit of sense. And we also know that there's something of a civil war. Alfonso, the Battler of Aragon, actually invades at one point in Burgos, that important central city in the Kingdom of Castile, and one of the cities that would have provided the most political support for Urraca's reign. It's no surprise then that as Urraca is able to, once and we know a lot about child mortality, so this next part's going to sound a little strange, but once she knows her kids are safe and have gotten through infant mortality stages around 5 or 6, she starts to put them in positions where they can start accumulating more and more power. We know, for example, that by 1111, Alfonso VII starts to be titled as King of Galicia. Now, this might not sound like much, but if we remember that he's probably born in 1105, that's a pretty great accomplishment for a 6-year-old. And in part, this kind of cadet kingship is a model practiced elsewhere in Europe. We know that lots of Roman emperors, Holy Roman emperors are practicing this, right? Getting their sons acclaimed as king of the Romans while they're still emperor. So this idea of naming a cadet king at the age of 6, right after we can sort of expect he's gone through most of the problems of early childbirth and infancy, once he's through the woods of some of those first epidemic diseases, the first time he gets malaria, the first time you might get the flu, right? Now we're starting to think about the kind of long track record that infancy really has in the medieval world. We can start to see that kind of spot where now, okay, he's 6, we can call him King of Galicia. That serves 2 functions. First, the Gallego nobles in Urraca's court seem to have been the most difficult for her to pacify in any sense. We actually see in some instances the archbishops of Santiago de Compostela openly defying Urraca's reign. So by nominating her son, this is a sort of saying, hey, bishops, you're a little feisty, nobles, you're a little bit feisty. I've got a son, he's going to take over, so now let's start building this relationship back up. It's worth thinking about what that says, that already at the age of 6, he's been named a king. Now, that doesn't mean he's actually doing anything administrating, right? This is titular only. But it's a powerful signal that Urraca intends for Alfonso to take over. At the same time, she also seems to be starting to maneuver her older child, her daughter, Sancha Raimundez, into a position of authority that has a long tradition in medieval Iberia. Sancha will eventually take over a group of lands that are on the borderlands between León and Castile, in what's now called the Tierra de Campos, the Infantazgo region. This kind of specific, separate, it's not quite a dowry, it's not quite an aras, the royal queenship income, but a sort of separate, independent series of lordships that seem to provide the daughters of the royal family, when not married to other monarchs or to other princes, instead this kind of base of support where they can exercise their own independent lordship. Both Lucy Pick, Therese Martin, Patrick Henriet, and also Gianna Bianchini have all shown that this region serves as a kind of measure that this is how important the kingship is. This is how important the monarchy is, how capable it is, that we can set a daughter aside to exercise this independent lordship, a kind of signal that this is a woman not entirely dissimilar to the Virgin Mary, that has this separate, elevated status. They're not the most important figure in the larger makeup, but they are that second tier, right? This is an important figure if we think about the analogy between Jesus and Mary, between Alfonso and his sister Sancha. We see a lot of instances of Sancha's own charters where she'll refer to her brother as the emperor, but only in clauses of deity. She's exercising really independent authority. By positioning her kids in that way, it sort of sets up what is to come. So that by 1116, when Alfonso is starting to take over, he's all of 11, he starts to be labeled as ruling in Toledo. So he's taken the two sort of ends of the kingdom, two very important, politically important areas, two areas that both have their own archbishops, both of whom have some real political power within the kingdom. He's starting to sort of really be positioned to take over, so that by the time he finally accedes to the throne in 1126, this is a guy who's been groomed for power, whose influence and authority, whose relationships with the court are well established, and whose family has a pretty strong record of holding on to things, even though times were quite difficult.
Okay, so my quick follow-up question, because I was really curious about this. Alfonso VII's sister, who ends up getting this very independent and really, in its own way, very important land, territory, and amount of power, did she ever marry?
No, this is actually a really important distinction, Nick. Not only does she not marry, but she seems to be a part of this tradition of unmarried women who, because they maintain, at least textually, of course we have no record other than their contemporary claims, because they maintain perpetual virginity and often have the incomes of a lot of churches, right, and a lot of towns, they seem to be this kind of symbol that this is how important this family is, right? And it's important to remember the medieval monarchies are called monarchies, but they rarely are only one individual, right? Gianna Bianchini's model of plural monarchy, this idea that this is a ruling family plus their friends plus their in-laws, this kind of collaborative enterprise is there. And so setting the daughter aside, that's a big investment, right? And holding this independent lordship as unmarried women and doing all of the things that you would expect of lords, right? We have, for example, Sancha Raimunda's rather famously is able to administer her own justice when it comes to some of her townsfolk are fishing when they're not supposed to in part of the river. And there are all kinds of records that suggest that she's not just collecting income and then like goofing off, right? She's doing all of these normal lordly things that we would expect of male rulers. And so both because she is an exception, and it's sort of a very clearly defined one, but because that exception has a lot of important significance. One of the things that Lucy Pick has recently suggested is that the women who hold these border territories are actually the kind of sacralization of Leonese and Castilian kingship, because Leonese and Castilian kings, for the most part, are not crowned and anointed the way French kings are. Right? They seem to be sort of elevated because of their military significance, and it's in fact the female part of the dynasty that has this kind of sacralization, right? And if we sort of think about the Marian symbolism there, that's not insignificant. And it's important to remember that, of course, much later, Mary has this enormous role in the religious life of the Iberian Peninsula, right? She's the signal saint that gets exported to the New World, and for that reason, we've got all over Latin America, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, Nuestra Señora, right? There's all kinds of examples there. So we shouldn't undersell that sort of connection. We've got a perpetual virgin reigning over her own territory, closely affiliated to a royal line, and so there's a lot of influence there. And Sancha will actually continue to administer that territory after her brother dies. She outlives him. Interesting. And she'll continue to do that even into the reign of her nephew, Fernando II of León, her nephew Sancho III of Castile, but also her great-nephew, Alfonso VIII, who, of course, is king at all of about 5 when his father dies of a rather sudden fever, about which we'll speak hopefully in a couple weeks. There's a lot of energy to these positions. And so it's really interesting that Urraca's two children sort of occupy these two sort of major roles in Iberian monarchy in the period. So that's a great question. Do you have any others before we get back to Alfonso himself?
It's kind of slightly backtracking just a little bit, but I was really curious. You mentioned that whenever they had taken certain territories, they began this process of repopulating it with more Christian-style populations. What would that process be like?
Right. So this used to be called in Spanish historiography repoblación. That's, as is usually the case, anytime there's a one-word answer for historiography, we know that it's not true, right? But like most of those answers, right, it gets at sort of something else that's going on there. In a lot of cases, what this looks like, and most recently, Alexandra Junta has done a great book about colonization in the Upper Ebro Valley, which is of course really wealthy, right? That's where Rioja wine comes from, and so it has a lot of important cultural and economic significance. Often, what it looks like happens is that the kings will issue privileges that are usually referred to as fueros in Spanish. A really great edition and translation of one of these, the Fuero of Cuenca, probably from 1191 or so, issued by Alfonso VIII, survives and has been translated by Jim Powers. It's a really fascinating read for a medieval law code, which I know doesn't sound interesting, but it's actually really fascinating as a look into what's going on. Most of these law codes go through several versions, right? As you can imagine, as a town grows, you need to come up with new laws and new rules. But for the most part, what they'll say is those who settle, right, those who are citizens of this place, can get these certain tax immunities, right? And we're talking about major immunities, right? Immunities from, okay, if I'm importing bread and wine for consumption or religious service inside the town of blah blah, then there's no tax whatsoever. Considering that most of the taxes that kings levied on goods traveling was the portazgo tax, the portage tax, that's a big immunity, right? So if you're importing things freely, that's a big economic incentive. And so if we couple that with a lot of protections for territory, with a provision of justice and legal representation in some cases, these kinds of charters to set out, okay, here are the boundaries of your town, here are the legal privileges that you have, and here are the ways that you're sort of protected. It gives you a kind of insight as to how they were able to attract people. So it's migration by pull, right? Which is how most migration works. It's both push and pull, right? Push, there's not enough opportunities at home. Pull, there's more opportunities here on the frontier. Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Alfonso VII takes the throne in 1126. He's about 21 years old. Of course, he's been Cadet King by now for about 15 years in Galicia, had control over Toledo for another 10, and he really starts to take his own as a king. One of the things that shows up rather interestingly early on is that he starts to develop more and more relationships with peninsular powers, but he also starts to expand a lot. He seems to be a pretty quiet king early on in his career. Right? We normally expect, okay, I'm king, now I've got to get something done to prove myself. But it seems that this track record suggests, at the very least, some kind of long-standing connection with what's going on. At the same time, of course, he's worried about this newly arrived, all of about 25 years in the peninsula or so, Almoravid Empire, right? Mm-hmm. And the Almoravids are not informidable, right? We know they start as a tax revolt and a tax reform movement in the Maghreb, and that is to say modern Morocco. And they're really substantial because by reforming tax codes, they can say, look at how many things we're not asking you to do, so you should follow us, right? Famously, the Almoravids are responsible for eclipsing Valencia and retaking Valencia after Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar's widow has to flee 2 years after his death, right? She holds onto it for 2 whole years by herself, which is pretty remarkable. Alfonso VII seems to be this kind of king that's pretty quiet for a long time. We know that there are lots of reasons later on in his kingship that might suggest where this Golden Rose gift comes from. So I want to fast forward a little bit because there's about 15 years of quiet. One of the first markers that he might be developing a relationship with the Cistercian order, and therefore that might suggest some later connection with Eugenius III, is that he provides some of the resources for founding an abbey that eventually becomes the Abbey of Fitero. It's at a different place early on, but as is usually the case, monasteries will move around a lot in their first generation. The monastery of Fitero becomes this Cistercian anchor in León and Castile, and will eventually become the founding energy behind the military order of Calatrava, which of course has this long connection with Castile especially, but not insignificantly also with León. The founding of military orders and the connection between the military orders that were already growing up in the Holy Land, as well as the knighthoods that have been developing in León and Castile, is just one marker that something is starting to really develop. We know too that there are papal legates that are visiting the peninsula. And for those not familiar, a legate is basically a deputy pope while they're on legation, right? In fact, papal legates will often say that they are issuing an order because they're holding the place of the Lord Pope, and then they'll insert the name of the Pope, right? Papal legates have a lot of power, and this kind of connection between Rome and León and Castile is starting to bring them together, ideally to connect them with one another in a way that's more significant. Of course, there haven't been any big alarm bells ringing in Latin Christendom at this point, although León and Castile are sort of at a tense detente with the Almoravids. They're back and forth pieces. And as Portugal is starting to develop, and that occupies actually a lot of Alfonso's early energy, figuring out what to do with Portugal, what to do with Navarra, what to do with Aragon, especially once the sort of weird succession problem of Alfonso the Battler dying without an heir. They have to go get his brother, who's a monk from a monastery. They untonture him somehow. They annul the tonsure. They get him married to the daughter of some Catalan nobles. They get married, and then that creates this massive mess, right? So he's trying to slowly work his way into holding some sway, right? So now we've got establishing the Cistercians. We've got papal legates coming to the peninsula, recognizing that, in fact, okay, here's something that's real that's going on. We've got an increased connection with the church. And then he starts to really put himself on a path towards gaining more territory. As the Almoravids start to disintegrate, both from internal pressure, internal division, but also external threats. They're being eclipsed in North Africa by the Almowahido and the Almohads, who are very different. Where the Almoravids were sort of political and economic reformers, the Almohads are very much more religious and culturally oriented towards a very different model of Islam, with huge theological differences from the Almoravids. So as the Almoravids are starting to disintegrate, there are a number of opportunities that are presenting themselves, right? Where Alfonso VI, Alfonso the Emperor's grandfather, had participated in and benefited substantially from this parias relationship. Sometimes it's referred to as protection money or extortion by Christian kingdoms on Muslim kingdoms. That seems to be inaccurate. Recent research has suggested instead that Muslim kingdoms were essentially saying, hey, Christian kingdoms, you've got some extra dudes. Why don't we pay them to come fight our wars for us? Which is a really beneficial relationship if we're dealing with mostly small-scale conflict between these sort of Taifa states that grew up in the aftermath of the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate in 1031. That same sort of process is starting to happen. And in fact, this post-Almoravid period is sometimes referred to as the second Taifa period. The Taifa label, Taifa in Arabic has some kind of sense of political party or faction. And the sort of second Taifa period, the disintegrating of the Almoravid Empire in the peninsula, gives Alfonso a lot of opportunities. Opportunities like the conquest, for example, of Coria in 1142, where he's able to really take over for his own a territory that had previously belonged to Alfonso VI. He had lost it from the Almoravids, and now they're able to retake it. And not only retake it, but Alfonso very quickly sends clerics to Rome to say, hey, we've got this territory. It looks like it'd be a great spot to put a bishop. Can't we have a diocese, right? And we might overlook that and think, well, okay, he needs somebody to do church stuff there. But the creation of a new diocese not only was a signal to Rome that, hey, we're really working on these projects you care about. We're really trying to expand the frontiers of Christendom, to borrow the line of Jonathan Phillips' great book on the Second Crusade. But we're also able to see this as a kind of marker of new administrative territory, right? Adding a new state, to take an American example, was a big deal, right? And we can sort of think about that comparison. What does that mean about the kind of era that we're living in? That means more people, that means more development, that means more tax revenue, that means more military resources. But of course, that's not without some precursory activity. We know that Alfonso VII has a number of closely affiliated Muslim friends and allies. The two most famous of these are Zafadullah and Ibn Mardanish, respectively two of these sort of Taifa kings. We know that in 1133, for example, Alfonso actually helps Zafadullah retake some territories in the south. So much so that it really is remarkable, this thought of like, I'm going to help you win your wars because then you'll owe me and you'll pay me for the help, right? So much so that when Zafadullah finally dies, Alfonso is heartbroken. He says, "Who has murdered my friend? Who has murdered my Zafadullah?" And even his title, Zafadullah, is a nickname. It's almost certainly a corruption of Saufadullah, the sword of religion, a title that has a little bit of mojo to it. And so have this supposed Christian emperor in the north collaborating with Muslim kings who have nicknames like the sword of religion, and Ibn Mardanish is often referred to in Latin sources as Rex Lupus, as El Rey Lobo, as the wolf king. These are powerful allies for him. And so after securing their territories, the bits that are left up, Alfonso can start gobbling those up and taking them over. And it's those kind of small holy wars, both helping his Muslim allies and friends, but also taking over his own territory, that really starts to give him more momentum. He takes over a small bit of territory to Reja in 1139. He retakes Coria in 42. From 43 to 46, he helps a character by the name of Ibn Ghaniya try to retake Cordoba unsuccessfully. Eventually, the Almohads and the Almoravids will bat back and forth, and eventually Cordoba gets retaken, and of course stays under Muslim control until the 13th century when Fernando III takes over. But all of these are these moments that are coming right up upon the real problem. And I think the real key to understanding where this golden rose comes from in the relationship between Eugenius III and Alfonso VII is exactly this moment. Because in 1144, there's a real problem. Edessa has fallen in the east to a new threat, and a threat that the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and the principalities affiliated with it, right? All of those crusader states that we often see in maps, the county of Tripoli. Once Edessa falls to the Zangid dynasty, there are real alarm bells, right? Edessa was not only the sort of first of the Crusader principalities, but it's also in a lot of ways the protective shield that keeps, in a lot of cases, the Turkish powers, the Seljuks and their successor states, from pouring into the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. It sets off alarm bells. It sets off alarm bells enough that Eugenius III starts to really demonstrate this interest in this Second Crusade, right? He sends his mentor, Bernard of Clairvaux, preaching, and of course, famously, this leads to Louis of France, of Eleanor of Aquitaine, all heading off on crusade, right? There's all of these tensions, all of these figures, all going off in the Second Crusade. But it fails catastrophically. Really, really badly does it fail. And so much so that we can start to think about, okay, well, what are the successes for the Second Crusade? We know that Lisbon is recaptured in Portugal, and that not without some substantial assistance from Crusader forces, landing, being co-opted by Alfonso Henriques, and then some of them staying. There are also some precursory wars that Jonathan Wilson has studied, which suggest that Cistercians, they show up again, and some Crusader forces alongside the Portuguese are also involved in attacks on Santarém. In the process, all of this seems to be suggesting that where the real opportunity might be is in the Iberian Peninsula. Enter the campaign for Almeria in 1147. We know quite a lot about Almeria from contemporary Arabic records. Jim Tedesca has actually shown that, in fact, if you wanted to go buy knockoff Baghdad silks, the best place to buy them was Almeria, which, we might lampoon, but if you think about it, it's kind of difficult, unless you really know what you're looking for, to tell a fake Louis Vuitton bag from a real one. And if it's a good fake, it might fetch a decent price. Almeria silks were very valuable, and we know that some less scrupulous types, when their trading season was done, might take to naval raiding. Of course, we call that by a different name, and piracy presented a real problem. Not only a real problem for merchants, but also for the popes who were trying to organize large overseas campaigns, a lot of which would go by boat. If we add to that the fact that Almeria as a haven for piracy serves as a really big thorn in the side of the overseas Christian trading communities, especially Pisa and Genoa. Venice hasn't entered that sort of Western realm yet, and Amalfi's being eclipsed. The coalition formed between Pisa, Genoa, and Alfonso VII to retake Almeria is huge. It's even larger when we were to look at a map. A contemporary map would show you that León and Castile are quite a long ways from Almeria, and to get there, you have to cross a lot of Muslim territory. Conveniently enough, Alfonso can do that because he has friends in the king of Murcia and in the king of Jaén or Baeza, depending on how Zafadullah wanted to style himself. So he can effectively cross through his friend's backyard in order to take this territory that was a problem for them because it was not allied with them, but instead with other forces, and which he could get naval support for. It's a stunning success. They're able to take Almeria. They'll lose it, spoiler alert, almost as soon as Alfonso VII dies, but that's not without some success. And we know that there's a poem written about the conquest of Almeria, that the involvement of Italian principalities were also deeply involved with these kind of Iberian campaigns because they represented huge markets. Earlier in the 12th century, there were a collaboration between Pisa and the Counts of Barcelona to try and retake the Balearic Islands for only a little bit, but with some success. And these kinds of naval and terrestrial collaborations between the Italian and maritime republics and the peninsular powers of the Iberian theater really presents an opportunity. Taking Almeria in 1147 and getting ready to take Jaén in 1148 presented then the one great shining moment. The Second Crusade has failed catastrophically. The Wendish campaigns in the Holy Roman Empire that are starting are brutal, they're bloody, they're really slow going. There's not a lot for anybody to get excited about. So Alfonso VII is effectively, he and perhaps Alfonso Henriques, his cousin, in Portugal, were pretty much the only successful military forces against Muslim powers, right? Now, of course, the situation in Iberia is way more complicated than Christian good, Muslim bad, as it always is, right? But from a papal perspective, this is a bit of hope. Hope is a really important thing when you think about when the Golden Rose, this artifact that we started with, was first sent from the Pope to the recipients. We don't know exactly when the rose itself was sent, but by tradition, usually it was sent on a particular liturgical occasion. That occasion is often referred to by its Latin name, Laetare Jerusalem, Laetare Sunday. It's 3 Sundays before Easter, so 2 Sundays before Palm Sunday. Traditionally, it's a moment of incredible hope. That very name, Laetare Jerusalem, Laetare, rejoice, take joy in, be glad for, right, is a moment of happiness. Traditionally, if you were to go into most modern Catholic churches, and even if you were to look at a lot of earlier examples, you'll see the priests wearing pink vestments. We normally associate pink with a lot of different cultural baggage in a modern English-speaking world, but pink has a lot of hopefulness to it. If you think about it, babies, when they come out, at least if they have this kind of Northern European complexion, come out pink and happy. Yeah. Flowers, when they're blooming, pink is a very hopeful color. Pink is also usually the color of the vestments. Pink is the color of roses. And so on that Laetare Sunday, it's a kind of moment of hope. But what else is going on then? If you look at the old liturgical ordo, one of the stories that often gets included and is sort of traditionally a kind of bedrock part of the gospel readings for Laetare Sunday is the miracle of loaves and fishes and loaves, right? That moment when Jesus is able to say, guys, we don't have enough for even a snack, but pass it around, right? And because we hope that it will come always much smaller than what we see on the earth, there's this miraculous expansion, right? It's this miraculous growth. Miraculous growth is probably a pretty good metaphor for what's happening in the Iberian Peninsula. Eugenius, beset by all these problems, the fall of Edessa, the failure of the Crusade, is able to say, hey, you're the next best hope we've got. Now, we don't know what exactly instructions were there for when the messenger carrying the Golden Rose conveyed it to Alfonso VII, but we can imagine that this imperial figure, this figure with enormous political power and prestige in the peninsula, this figure who has a lot of influence over his contemporaries, this figure who's seen recent successes, both supporting Muslim vassals who are allied with him against the more problematic figures, but whom also are helping him in his own conquest of territories, really stands out as a figure of hope. If we add into the fact that admittedly a failed campaign to take Jaén in 1148 followed that year, we can start to see this larger growth of this relationship between Rome and Alfonso VII. It's not without problems, of course. The presence of Taifa kings, of Muslim kings in Alfonso's court is not without some complication for Rome. It's not also without some complication that in 1155, Alfonso yells at a papal legate for making a rather important distinction between Santiago and Toledo. Alfonso favors Santiago usually because that's where he's come up and made his bones, but there is still a need to sort of balance between the two political powers. Then at Valladolid in 1155, a legate, having made the wrong decision, gets a piece of Alfonso's mind. All this is to say that gift-giving represents the change of a relationship, right? Even if it's just to confirm what had previously been there, this giving of a rose covered in gold, this symbol of hope, really marks out Alfonso as a kind of figure that suggests that the relationship between Rome and the Iberian Peninsula is changing, and changing in important ways. We know that after Alfonso VII, his two sons, Fernando II and Sancho III, split the dynasty, as is usual and Iberian practice, and will start to see their own success. Sancho won't. He dies of a fever, but his son, Alfonso VIII, he and the Leonese monarchs will start to push the boundaries further and further south, despite Almohad difficulties. They'll be defeated time and again. There'll be problems, as is usually the case. The Christian kingdoms of Iberia are fighting each other more often than they're fighting the Muslim powers of the south. But there are crusades that are successful, there are conquests that are successful, and the boundaries starting to move forward, in part because the support of Rome allows the Iberian kingdoms to really sort of conceive of themselves as something important. This is a part of the kind of identity construction that's happening. And it's a part of them taking themselves quite seriously as crusaders. It's a part of the introduction of the crusade movement to Iberia in a really substantial way. As William Perkins has noted, it's probably in this period that we can start to really see an uptick in crusade energy in the Iberian Peninsula. And it's not without a good reason that he's able to make that claim. The giving of this small gift in a rose can tell us that by any other name, the relationship between Rome and Castile, Rome and León, Rome and Galicia is growing closer and closer together. So that even when Alfonso has to recognize under papal pressure that yes, in fact, I guess Portugal is separate. Manifestus Probatum says that now Portugal is a separate kingdom, but they should recognize my influence, right? This is always this negotiated process. The medieval world doesn't move in straight lines, it moves in tacks and jibes. So even as that relationship is developing, the giving of a rose covered in gold is a symbol of the kind of hope that the papacy has for the Iberian theater. It's worth noting that after that, it's given as well to a number of other kings, right? We have the example, especially of the French kings receiving these roses, but it really starts to pick up as a symbol of papal confidence in either a particular enterprise, like the building of a church, of noblemen as patrons of the church itself. And although there had been one previous recipient that we know of, Fulk of Anjou in 1196, Alfonso VII is really the first high-profile figure to receive a rose, and it's worth noting that after that, within a generation, another 3 or 4 roses are probably given, right? We know of a couple of confirmed examples, but we can never say with certainty that it's just these 3. So that's a bit of an insight into the Golden Rose, into the relationship that's changing between Rome and the Iberian Peninsula, especially under Alfonso the Emperor. There isn't a way for me to take questions from anyone else. We're not live streaming this. But as representative of the audience, listeners, Nick, do you have questions that I can answer?
Yeah, actually. This has covered a lot, and this is great. Like Dr. Lackner, I love it when someone can just sit there and just hit a subject the way you've just done it. You covered so many topics, from papal legates and Rome's focus into the Iberian Peninsula to something I'm just now really starting to get interested in that I actually just discovered, and that is Christian soldiers fighting for Islamic factions. Of course, there's a monetary benefit for that. I'm sure they like the experience also, but that is absolutely fascinating. I feel like that alone would make a very interesting episode all by itself.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Lauer has done some really interesting work on Christian mercenaries in Al-Andalus and in the Maghreb. And it really is quite fascinating that there is this sort of exchange and experience. And of course, Bill Jordan has just published a book about Muslims who come back with Louis IX from Tunisia and come to France, which, is a really fascinating idea. And of course, exactly what they were doing, right? He unpacks, but it seems to suggest that there was some kind of relationship between Louis and these guys that he's bringing back. How that developed, we rarely get glimpses of. And so this idea that there would be this kind of collaborative détente is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's a very important point in pointing out that the medieval world was a lot more complicated than I think some of the older historiographers make it out to be. Because you're seeing that and you're like, whoa. So it's not like, hey, it's them and us, like we're these two separate, we don't get along, we're always fighting under religious influences. But then you see this and it flips that whole narrative upside down. And you're like, whoa, not only are they, fighting possibly realistically alongside other Muslim troops on these campaigns, but this is apparently something that you see happening in this exchange between like Alfonso VII having a nickname for a fellow ruler who is also a Muslim. And so that's absolutely fascinating.
To add to that, there are more examples from the time of Alfonso VII's grandsons. Alfonso IX, everybody's named Alfonso, sorry. Alfonso IX of León and Alfonso VIII of Castile are the most bitter of enemies, right? In part because Alfonso VIII becomes king before his cousin, and because kings and kings are often associated with one another in terms of their liturgical function when it comes to crowning and ceremonial stuff. Alfonso VIII of Castile, the Castilian king, has the Leonese king kneel and kiss his hand while he's being acclaimed as King of León, which is an enormously humiliating gesture, right? For one king to kneel and kiss the hand of another. Alfonso VIII notes that, this is the year in which Alfonso of León kissed the hand of the king. In all of his charters, his royal documents are dated, right, with these little bits of news that tell us like what the big events were. He'll include that for a few years until eventually that sort of becomes eclipsed because something new has happened, right? And then a new big piece of news. But that's one element. And as a result, perhaps, in the aftermath of the defeat of Alarcos in 1195, when the Castilians rushed to meet the Almohads in a pitched battle, Alfonso IX of León allies with the Almohads, eventually gets a crusade called against him in 1196. The Portuguese are supposed to collaborate with the Castilians. The Castilians inevitably get help from the Aragonese to all kind of gang up on León and slap them around a little bit for allying with the Almohads. But that's at the same time that, allegedly, we don't have great evidence for this, that Sancho VII of Navarre, who at his death is probably somewhere around 6'8", based on the measurements of his femur, as preserved in the cathedral in Pamplona, is also leading a mercenary company among the Almohads. So there's a lot of precedent for this kind of back and forth activity, as well as of Christian powers allying with Muslims and vice versa, right? A topic that in its more mundane and therefore probably more significant measures Simon Barton, before his death, analyzed in his book Conquerors, Brides, and Concubines, right? Sexual boundaries in the medieval world are also a place where we can see a lot of, friction when it comes to the political intensity that happens, right? Women's bodies are often a subject for rulers and lawgivers to really focus on what should be and what shouldn't be. And so there's a lot of instances of participating with Muslim leaders and of Muslim leaders collaborating with Christians and vice versa, as well as lots of cases where we've got laws that are kind of dealing with how these mixed unions play out on the ground.
I like that you touched on and I feel like this is something a lot of people don't realize, or especially novices like me, and I think what your distinction of this is important, the symbolism involved in the golden rose. Like, for example, you mentioned the popes would give bishops, the wool collar, and that's how that transfers into a relic when it's touched the shrine, so on and so forth. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that such a major fabric within the medieval society revolved around the importance of symbols, whether it be architecture or gifts like that. And I think that's a very important thing that you brought up that I really, really found interesting. As far as the papal legates going into the Iberian Peninsula and taking notice of Alfonso VII and what is going on there. And so I thought that was pretty interesting how you start seeing, like you were bringing up, the diocese in the medieval Iberian Peninsula, the roles that play, the different bishops, and of course this papal involvement that you're starting to see. That really, when you look from what I've seen of the history of Spain, that papal influence and interest seems to only get stronger when it comes to the Iberian Peninsula, especially after the rise of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, especially.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, and I think it's easy to look at some of these, signal figures and say, like, this is when it changed. But in reality, like, rarely does a big change happen overnight. And I think, if you look at Isabella and Ferdinand, right, at the end of the 15th century, they're in a lot of ways a continuation of a much, much longer story, right? A story that goes back to Fernando III and his conquest of Cordoba and Seville, a story that goes back to Alfonso VII and his attempts to really kind of push much deeper than it had been done. Alfonso VI and Toledo. I mean, all the way back to the sort of myth of Visigothic refugees fleeing to Asturias and being led by this duke named Pelayo, who almost certainly doesn't exist. This kind of legend of connection, right? They don't tell that story in the 15th century because it's true, right? They know it's not. But what they're interested in is, if we tell these stories, right, if we create this version of events, if we say that the reason we're doing this is because we have this ancestral burden, then we can start to see a bigger continuity, right? They want to see their relationship with Rome as this kind of signal victory. And it's worth noting that the very church where the Golden Rose was probably, we don't know for the very early period, we know much later, that where it was probably blessed and issued was the titulus church, the title parish of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, which has this long connection to the True Cross, to St. Helena, and to all of the complications of religious ritual in the late antique period, and the cross called as it develops. We know that place, right, in 1492, there's a whole chapel, you can see it now, that has this long inscription narrating the fall of Granada in 1492, right? So this whole story can come full circle in some ways, that the place that gave Alfonso VII the Golden Rose for his activities in defense of Christendom against Islam is now also seeing, 3.5 centuries later, the celebration of Fernando and Isabella's conquest of Granada after, a decade-long war, that there's this kind of long relationship that's built up, right? Rarely does history move like a lightning bolt. It's more often a glacier. Right. But if you think about it, a lightning bolt doesn't do quite as much as a glacier can do, as I sit, here in a valley carved out by the Mississippi, right? Water moving slowly over time does a lot more than electricity can. So we can definitely find some parallels, I think, in the relationship as it changes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another important thing to all of our subscribers who are seeing this. There will be a second episode in the future that will pick up where this one leaves off. And honestly, this lecture by Dr. Lincoln has covered so much. Yeah. And, I can only imagine what the next episode will encompass on the subject of not only people and characters and events, but just the pure complexity of the medieval world, and especially a complex place such as medieval Spain. Dr. Lincoln, I thank you so much for your time. You have been phenomenal, and honestly, it's truly an honor to have people like you on this channel.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk to people. We, scholars often like to get stuck in our offices and work on research articles, but I sent off an article last week, so I got all this free time. We might as well do this again.